Welcome. Welcome everybody and good afternoon. We have a wonderful group today, don't we? Yeah, we have a wonderful learning community here that take the time to come to listen to, I think will be a wonderful talk today. Sandra want me to say a few words to welcome the community here, so that's what I'm doing now. That I want to mention that how happy I am that Asian Studies program and the Schemel Forum, we have collaborated several times, and it is a happy collaboration for many times. And I think this is a wonderful way of reaching out to the community with multifaceted background. So I hope we can continue to do that. And then I think it's also wonderful that the Schemel is very well known, not only for the cultural projects, but also for international affairs. And so I think it's natural in today's global setting that to introduce and include Asia into the programming. And I cannot express how happy I am that Sandra and I will share similar kind of a global vision here. And I'm also very happy to see Dr. Nancy Steinhardt again, because we had her here as our keynote speaker in spring 2015 when we have the international conference on Asian Studies. So she was wonderful, and today I think you'll be amazed by her again. Then I also like to add a little plugin as an added bonus for Schemel members. That is that last Thursday we had our tea ceremony event, and it was fantastic. Many people have given us wonderful feedback. And today we have the art along the Silk Roads. That's going to emphasize how Silk Roads serve as a conduit, the median to connect West, Central, and East Asia. And it's a wonderful example to show that how we can grow stronger together rather than to see each other as enemies. Then next weekend, Friday night, that we also have two events. So if you have time, please consider it. And the more details is on the campus event calendars that is open to the public. 3:30, we have a talk on polygamy. That means one husband, multiple wives. And its impact on the social political setting in traditional Chinese society. That's by Dr. Paul Golden, Nancy's colleague in the same department. Then at night at 7 o'clock, we have the classic Chinese music played by a well-known Chinese lute player at 7 p.m. The two events will complement together and actually link to what Nancy was going to talk about today, because Nancy, am I right? I saw a couple of your slides earlier. I came in early, so I already get a sneak preview. Like you are going to talk about Tang Dynasty.
It'll come up, yeah.
And so that's about 7th to 10th, early 10th century. And so next week the event also is derived from the Tang Dynasty. So it will complement what we already learned today. Okay, great. Thank you. And I want to give a stage to Sandra to introduce our wonderful speaker.
Thank you. Thank you all for coming. Lest we think that globalization and foreign trade are new and controversial inventions of the 21st century, we, the Schemel Forum, in collaboration with the Department of Asian Studies, are calling to your attention this evening the Silk Road, or more accurately, the Silk Routes, plural. They comprise the ingenious trade network established by the Han Dynasty, if I'm correct, in China, 130 BCE. That was regularly used for trade with the West until 1453 of the Common Era. when the Ottoman Empire boycotted trade with the West and closed all routes. Some of you have traveled the Silk Road, and some of us hope to do that. My appetite for the subject was whetted last year when I had the privilege of hearing tonight's speaker talk about Chinese architecture, particularly about the American influence in it, more specifically in relation to the influence of the University of Pennsylvania's School of Architecture on some Chinese architecture. As some of you know, I am committed to recognizing that interdependence is a reality and not an ideal, and especially pleased to know that even in ancient times there were robust systems of connectedness moving through the Asian continent, material goods, wisdom, art, culture, and all aspects of human endeavor. How lucky we are to have Nancy Steinhardt to guide us on this journey on the Silk Road tonight, opening our eyes to the major sites and monuments along the Silk routes, the cultural as well as the commercial highways that linked East and West Asia for centuries. Please welcome Nancy Steinhardt.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here, or I should say a pleasure to be here again. I particularly like this very beautiful auditorium, and I know that my voice will carry in it. We have a lot to cover today. 3,000 years across Asia. So I'm going to begin right away. There are countless maps that I could show you of the Silk Roads. You'll probably see about 10 before we finish today. Whatever map you use, wherever you start, everyone here has probably heard of the Silk Roads, and if you have, you know that they're a network of interconnected trade routes, and it's plural. There's more than one way across. This map shows they join, they divide, they join, they divide, and there are actually at least 3 major routes plus the ones across the sea. But that they are a set of interconnected routes that connect China with Iran, with Saudi Arabia, with North Africa, with Europe, without forgetting that India is in the mix, is part of this. And there's no map that I can show you that will show every site that I talk about, but a lot of them will be on the maps, and I'll try to show you where we are at any one point. Now, sometimes we know exactly what's found along these routes, so I have no labels. Wherever you come from, there's no question this is Roman glass. Wherever you come from, there's no question that plate was made in what we today call Iran during the Sasanian period, middle of the 3rd century to middle of the 6th century. And there's no question this is a Byzantine coin. But each of them was excavated in China, and each of them had to get to China by some route. So what we're really talking about is what happens when China meets Persia and Buddhist India is part of all this. So again, China, India, Persia, and the way that things move across. There are glittering images that fill the books and fill websites and fill posters of what the Silk Roads are. So here are 3, and here are 4, and here are 2 of the famous so-called mummies. We prefer now to call them desiccating corpses. They weren't mummified, but they are found at places on the Silk Roads. The challenge is to know where to begin, where to end, and how to put it all together. And so what I've decided to do this afternoon is look at the Silk Roads through 7 major moments. And I'm going to spend most of my time on that first moment. And I'm going to punctuate these moments with questions or concerns, or what I might call my personal principles of how to look at the Silk Roads. So the old images and the new images. These 2 probably no one here has seen. We're going to look at this again because this is a very interesting pattern to find on someone's garment, and that's a site that I'm sure no one has heard of or been to. It's called Topolokadung. What is also interesting about the Silk Roads is as soon as someone thinks she's figured something out, something new is excavated. This can happen definitely every year. It can happen every few weeks. It can happen every month. And then it causes you to reevaluate. And that's what drives this field. So here's what do we know? We know for sure that the Silk Roads were an extensive series of interconnected trade routes that crossed the Asian continent and joined the east to the west and to the south. We know that monks and merchants and military and pilgrims and expeditionaries traveled these routes. And this last group is one of the most interesting because it's books by people like you see photographed here. This photograph was taken around the year 1900. Men, it was all men, who crossed these routes and had read about places in history and wanted to see them and wanted to bring them to life again. One of the principles behind all of this is what I will call oases. You might find different words, but there are places where cities or something like cities have emerged where people stop. Sometimes they just stop to refuel, to buy supplies, to find water. Sometimes they like what they see or they can't go on. They begin to practice their trade there. They marry. They change religions. They proselytize, and ultimately they may end up passing away somewhere completely out of context from where they began. Now there are famous cities along these routes that everyone's heard of. Chang'an on the left, Chinese capital for most of its pre-modern history. Samarkand on the right. Anyone who's been on the Silk Roads has probably gone to these two places. Samarkand is a lot harder to get to than it used to be. There are places on the routes that everyone who's traveled the Silk Roads or read about them knows about. The Dunhuang Caves, city of Kashgar, farthest point west in China that's largely today a Muslim city, and a place like Turfan where every culture and every civilization of the Eurasian continent has made its mark. There are places that only people who know the Silk Roads know. Place like Miran at the top, place like Kucha on the right, hard to get to, and in the case of Miran, still today one of the only ways to get there is by camel. And then there are the places that are even harder to get to today than in the past. Hami is one, Buama is another. Both of them are in what we call Xinjiang or Xinjiang Autonomous Region of China, the westernmost part of China. And yes, everything that I show you has 5 pictures behind it that I could have chosen, and everything is beginning to make you, or drawing you to make connections with things that you know or things that you expect. Any book about the Silk Roads talks about the man that you see on the right. His name, Ferdinand von Richthofen. He was a German geographer, and he's the person who coined this term, Silk Roads. Seidenstrasse. He traveled these routes many times. He mapped the routes that you see here. And there are 3 most important ones. The north, the south, and the one between. And in this case, the north is not so well shown, and then as I mentioned, they join and then they separate again. At least one route comes to India, and if I had a different map, I would show you the Silk Road of the Sea. Now, sometimes we go too far. Sometimes people are inclined to think that everything that we see, which is a puzzle anywhere on the Asian continent, could only have happened because of the Silk Roads. So, for instance, in this slide in the upper right, you are looking at turquoise. And it was excavated in north-central China, the city of Luoyang, and it has a clear date because of the tomb it was excavated in of 1700 BCE. When people first found this, they said, turquoise, Afghanistan. And look what we have here. We have an Egyptian female from the 3rd millennium BCE, and there was turquoise used here. We're going to see her again. But this actually wasn't true. Turns out that turquoise is native to the region of Hunan. And on the left, something that remains a puzzle. Jade has been found, fairly sophisticated jade with incisions that require sophisticated tools, and the date is unquestionably 3000 BCE, and I am in eastern Inner Mongolia, and the route that it got there isn't clear. But here are two facts after Richthofen that everyone learns about the Silk Roads. Marcus Crassus definitely was involved in the Silk Roads. And in either the year 54 or 53 BCE, which for those of us who are China-centered is the Han Dynasty in China, this Roman governor of Syria brought 7 legions eastward into battle. Within 24 hours, perhaps less, within a matter of hours, so here's the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire extended itself at its zenith through Turkey and places we see here, North Africa. At some point in this area called Parthia. Parthians are a people without a lot of fixed points. A lot of Parthians were merchants. They're middlemen moving things across. Somewhere in Parthia, the Roman army fell and people were taken prisoner. And some believe that those prisoners were taken eastward to China, or silk traveled from China, and the first silk that the Romans became aware of, the name therefore Silk Roads, happened as a result of Marcus Crassus. That theory was first published in 1957. The Parthians, if you like a hub, if you know history, if you've been to some of these sites, Parthians ruled Antioch, they ruled Commagene, today in Turkey, they ruled Petra in Jordan, still an open site, but harder to get to year by year than it was the previous year in Syria. Dura Europos, nobody knows if anything survives there right now. But we do know for sure that silk was made in China by the dynasty called Han, in fact by the 2nd century BCE. This is one of many, many examples I could show you of silk from China. And what you are looking at here are jade suits. Again, there are a lot of spectacular pictures I can show you, but I'm not interested in informing you that to preserve the corpse, Chinese made jade suits in the 2nd century BCE. I'm interested in telling you that they held together those suits either with gold thread or red silk thread. So the gold is interwoven into the silk. So no question, 2nd century BCE, there's silk in China. So the theory that we have this region, Parthia, Rome, China, they meet, maybe prisoners are taken. In any case, Chinese are also crossing. And the other theory about how silk gets to Rome is probably narrated in this image. This is a wall painting from Western China, this place I've mentioned, Xinjiang province, westernmost China. Some people refer to it as Chinese Central Asia. The names of places are sometimes more political than probably some people would like. Chinese part of Central or Inner Asia. And notice there isn't too much I can tell you about this. I can't tell you the date. But an interpretation that people like is that this is a Chinese princess who's wearing a very notable hat or headgear and has in front of her a bowl with what might be little eggs or silkworms, and a finger is pointing to the hat, and we have a deity holding implements that would have been used in the manufacture of silk, the silk goddess or god. So another theory is that a Chinese princess was given in marriage to a ruler from the West, and she wanted to have silk garments. It was illegal for silkworms to leave China. She put them pre-hatched in her headdress. She crossed. She brought them west. People looked at her clothes, looked at the silkworms, and we begin to see silk in the West. That's as plausible as anything else I can tell you. But what is a fact is that this intrigue about the Silk Roads, which is real, has been with us in the West for more than 100 years. And if you've never done this reading and you go home tonight or you go to your public library and you look up the books, you will read about Aurel Stein, Hungarian, working for the British, and Paul Pelliot, French, and the two Alberts, von Lecoq and Grünwedel, and Sven Hedden, who is a Swede, and Count Otani, who is Japanese, and Owen Lattimore, who comes from the USA, who all were traveling these routes in the first decades of the 20th century, buying things from museums, well, it's true, writing books, taking pictures, and then the roads closed. The roads closed because of war in the 20s, they became unsafe, and then the 30s, and then the 40s, and then the People's Republic is established in 49, and then Russia moves eastward and comes to Afghanistan, and then the Chinese push the Russians westward, and until about the 1980s, for about 50 years, this was territory that people knew about, but they didn't have too much that they could say. In fact, I sometimes refer to the Silk Roads as the vast dumping ground for the inexplicable. I and anyone who was in graduate school in the 60s or 70s or 80s can remember our teachers looking at something and saying, oh, it must come from the Silk Roads. And everybody nods, but nobody has a clue what's involved. So what we can do now is look at fixed points, because the Chinese own a lot of what's today the Silk Roads, and the Chinese excavate. And when they excavate a tomb, sometimes we have a date or we have other fixed points. And so we begin in around the 2nd or 3rd century AD or CE with a place that you've probably never heard of called Shambhala near Hutian, and the spellings also vary, but it's the place right here on the southern route that's called Hatan. So depending on what you know, you see something different. You may well want to call this a centaur, right? It's a human-headed horse. You see a long trumpet. If you know Buddhism, you see a Buddhist lotus. You see a green-eyed figure with a European nose, some kind of headgear, not sure why, and a spear. Well, here's my first principle. Beware a little knowledge. Because everybody who looks at this or anything else from the Silk Road sees something different. And one of the most interesting parts of studying the Silk Roads is that the Chinese usually publish the material and often don't have the same background that people in the West who look at it. So when I look from a Chinese perspective at this trumpet, I can tell you that in Korea in the year 357, someone painted this curved trumpet on his tomb, and I can show you this very, very similar long horn or likeness that's painted on the wall of a different, on the wall of a different tomb from the year 570. Let's go a little further. This is what we're really looking at. This is one of the major principles of the Silk Roads: pastiche, collage, pasting together. In the introduction, the Ottoman Empire was just mentioned. Well, the page that I'm showing you on the left is from an album leaf collected at some point that went into the collection of an Ottoman sultan. This is in the Topkapi Saray in Istanbul. He took pictures and literally pasted them all together in all directions. On the right is something nobody has ever explained from the Silk Roads, but it's juxtaposition without logical explanation. So, a nimbus tells us it should be a Buddhist deity. People probably think this is a Buddhist deity. There is no Buddhist deity who rides a zebra. It's not known. This is so far unknown iconography, but it has to have a meaning because it's very specific. And then it's juxtaposed with somebody on the camel, which should come from the region called Bactria, or even farther to the west. It depends whether the camel has one hump or two. This seems to be one. And this is a face that resembles, people would think, the Iranian world. So back to what you see here. This actually is the front part of a pair of pants. So it's one leg, there's another leg, it was all sewn together, and it is unknown who decided to wear this pair of pants, but it went into someone's tomb in Shahpura. Now this is really what this juxtaposition or pastiche or collage is all about. Everything that I show you here was excavated in the same cemetery. And all we would have is a latest possible date. We don't know the earliest time from which something would make its way into a cemetery, but this is Chinese lacquer, and here is our garment. And this is someone who is clearly European, and this could be a Chinese dragon, but it could trace to something much farther west. And this looks like someone wearing European military garb, and these are some kind of mythological creatures. And here's a Janus-like bird. We're looking at a lot of textiles from this early period. They're not silk. A lot of them are woven, tapestry, or wool. But they are perfect examples of this juxtaposition. So what we're looking at here was excavated at a site called Nia, and we can start right here. So there's the nimbus. So people think it's a deity. And there's the horn of plenty, so people say cornucopia. Well, the 7 interpretations of this female, and we assume it's female, she has breasts, are a bodhisattva. That would be an agent of the Buddha, but not clear which one. Demeter, the Greek goddess of harvest. Ishtar, Babylonian goddess. Anahita, Persian goddess of water and fertility. She looks like a fertility goddess. Hariti, the Indian guardian goddess of children. Tyche, the Greco-Gandharan goddess, or Ardasho, the Kushan goddess of wealth. And each person who saw this independently when it came out of the ground and opened that periodical, depending on where he or she sits and what he knows as he comes to it, had a different logical, convincing interpretation. So let's continue a little bit on this map that I showed you. Here's our Roman Empire. Here are our Parthians. I just mentioned the Kushans. Kushans are a semi-nomadic people who emerged in the northern part of India and include the territory of Pakistan and the westernmost part of China in circa the end of the 1st century BCE to about the 2nd century CE. The chronology is set, but nobody knows the birth dates of the first king. In other words, there's a chronology that says how long Kanishka on the left or Vima Kadphises on the right reigned, and some later conqueror got rid of the heads and they've never been excavated. But a very likely theory, good evidence is that you are looking here at the first representation of the Buddha, And this is Greek, Buddha. This is a coin with the ruler, Kanishka, front and back. A god king, well, Kanishka is seated here on a lion throne. Persians seated themselves on lion thrones. This is the world of kings. It's crossed from Persepolis in Iran today all the way to around right here. And so the Kushan theory, that when I mention the Kushans, that's another possibility for what you're looking at. Well, then we have what we have here. I'm always looking from the Chinese side, so I'm going to see a Chinese dragon. Well, here is my second principle. When you're convinced you've figured something out, look across Asia, because you will find another possibility just as convincing. When it comes to the Silk Roads, instinct and judgment may not serve you as well as they do under other circumstances. Yes, we all get paid for having the right instincts and being able to make a decision. But on the Silk Roads, you have to resist. Because even though I see a Chinese dragon, someone looking at this from India sees a makara on just as good of evidence. So the makara is a fish-like or sea creature that curls at the end. Here's the side. This is a gate. Its date is around the year 0, 50 years before or after in Sanchi, India, central India, Bhopal state. Here's what it looks like from the side. But the makara, some people say it's crocodile-like. It could be what we're looking at here. And then we haven't dealt with this yet, because that's all that's left. We have a tail. We have something that looks like a lion or tiger. We have a foot. Could be Hercules. Could be Samson. Could be someone else. It depends what you know and what you bring to the discussion. Our next site, all the sites we're looking at are on the southern Silk Road. This is still Xinjiang province. We're going on either side of what's called the Tarim Basin, pure desert. So here's Nia. That's what still survives there. This also survives there. It's not an easy site to get to. But there are objects like this. So when we see carving, and the desert sand preserves wood, when we see carving in wood, like you see on the left, the support probably for a table, when we see silk or wool or felt shoes, this certainly is a society of wealth. There are people who can afford to have these goods. And the textiles often from Nia often have inscriptions woven into them, and the inscriptions speak directly to anyone who has knowledge of Confucian or filial society in China. They read like this: "May this marriage between noble families bring countless generations of descendants," or "May this one-of-a-kind brocade bring the parents generation after generation of descendants." Well, this is what people put on corpses. The hope for generations of descendants in the afterlife. This is all silk. Some of it, this is a corpse excavated at Nia. Two other examples. You see the Chinese characters here. And one of the most interesting is this one that's raised a lot of controversy. Some of you know Chinese, so here, this one is easier to read than some of the others. The 5 phases, or the 5 elements, emerge from the eastern direction. And then this is the character nobody is sure how to translate, because it might mean "and profit China." So China is right here, central face, on the textiles excavated in Nia. But at the same cemetery, we have these 3 wooden pallets of voluptuous females, and Chinese make nothing like this, but India does. India makes these females at the end of the first, actually 2nd century BCE, pre-Buddhist, or sculpture not recognizing the Buddhism is aniconic at this point, but these two female sculptures, this one Barhut, this one Sanchi that I mentioned, are the likely source of the piece of wood from the same cemetery as one of many corpses that has silk with Chinese inscriptions around it. When I said it comes out of the Confucian tradition, it's not just this is what Confucians wish for their children. Every civilization wishes for progeny. All the inscriptions are in Chinese characters. That's why I said they come out of the Confucian tradition. So every site along the southern Silk Road that dates to the 2nd or 3rd century BCE has a towering stupa, a Buddhist monument that rises in India initially as a symbol of the Buddha, usually round in India so that it can be circumambulated. But it is, by the time it gets to Central Asia, within a monastery or a group of buildings. And this is where it gets very interesting, because if you put all the stupas together and look at them within plans, we have either the stupa, Chinese name is pagoda. By the time it gets to China, it becomes pagoda, and that word is first used by Portuguese merchants in India, but it's what it's called in China. So we have the pagoda in its own precinct with the courtyard in front, or we have a central stupa or pagoda with another precinct around it. And these are monastery plans that I can trace for you all the way to Japan. So Afghanistan here. So we were just in Central Asia, Chinese Central Asia. Now I'm actually farther west. I'm in Afghanistan with my stupa and my courtyards in front. I had to squeeze these in, so I'm not moving geographically here. Turfan, which is the eastern part of Chinese Central Asia. Now I'm in China, and I have dates of this monastery, 516. Here is our stupa, and here is the courtyard beyond it. And I'm not calling this a central stupa, because I'll show you what that is in just a minute. Clearer example in Korea with the pagoda and the stupa on a line, and then Japan. So in these cases, the pagoda's first. The pagoda with a Buddha hall, said stupa, pagoda with a Buddha hall on a line, compared to the central monument, which appears earlier in China, and this is just the remains of a pagoda with two walls around it. And North Korea, here's our pagoda with everything around it. At the same cemeteries, and here's Lolan, it's one of the sites we haven't heard of, but Southern Silk Road, 2nd and 3rd centuries, we have what I call purely Chinese imagery. This is an example where no one could find anything here that's not Chinese. I am specifically interested in the raven with 3 toes in the sun, because I can find you 100 examples of this image in China. So I put in 4 from the dynasty we've mentioned called Han. This example, 2nd century BCE, here's our raven, and here are his 3 toes. Here's one from around the year 0 in China. Here's what we just saw, and I keep coming back to Korea because it's relevant. That's how we get the farthest point of the Silk Road. To get to Japan, something has to cross the sea. Yingpan. I showed this image because Yingpan is a site that people became very, very interested in for a reason I'm about to show you. I'm about to show you the picture why. But it was mapped by Orlstein, the first of the expeditionaries I mentioned, the Hungarian who was paid by the British government. And this is one of his maps, and he knew a lot about it. Some of the most interesting desiccating corpses or mummies come from Ingpan, and the one on the left is often called the Ingpan man. He's nearly perfectly preserved. He was about 30 when he died. He measures 1.9 meters. A meter is more than 3 feet, so he's about 6 feet tall. He was found on his back. He was found inside a painted wooden coffin. Again, I don't have time to do everything, but every single one of these motifs can lead us somewhere. He was found on natural fiber, straw, or hemp, which is then placed on a wooden armature. He wears this mask, which is made of 3 levels of flax, and we're going to see this mask again for another reason. His head, I'll show it to you. Yeah, okay, there you go. The mask, again, raises questions and tells us something important. So here's our man, here's the mask, and you can hardly see that there's a little place here where gold was placed. So our Lady T also had gold inlay, and the ancient Sumerians inlaid gold. And the only point I'm making here is that gold almost always tells us royalty. Wealthy people didn't necessarily have gold in the ancient world, so probably he's a member of royalty. How is he buried? His head is on a pillow, which is, so you see the pillow right here, and the pillow is known as a jiming, a cock crowing pillow. He has an armband, which you see here. He wears silk pants. He has felt slippers. This is felt. One of the fabrics that he has 2 figures with knives and lassos. And when we combine them with horned animals, people will want to say Greece. But I would always be looking to the Buddhist world, even though it's later, and I would be looking to a Buddhist deity who holds a knife and holds a lasso. And then he had a pack of food, and he has this tiny garment, which has not been satisfactorily interpreted, but it measures 22.2 centimeters top to bottom. 2.54 centimeters is 1 inch, so it's less than 10 inches top to bottom, and 11.4 centimeters on his chest. And the thought is perhaps this is a wish for a future child. Perhaps this even is a reference to a child. We don't know. The last of these early sites that I look at is Miran, and I've mentioned it already, but it's a little bit different because Miran has remains not only of the stupa, but actually of caves, and there are paintings inside the caves. It is a largely Buddhist site. It has Buddhist figures. When we see the nimbus and we see the bald-headed monks, we assume Buddhism. Buddhist figures that look to come from India or farther west, and Buddhist figures that look to come from much later in China, but they're all together on the walls. We look at sculpture, we look at architecture. People look at the image on the right and they say Alexandria, Coptic Egypt. They look on the left, they see the hat, which is called a Phrygian cap, and people from the area of Turkey wore it. They look on the right and say, this reminds me of Roman provincial interior painting in a house, and it does, except that the figures don't look Roman, they look more Indian. And this brings me to that was my longest section. This brings me to my second section, which is how Buddhism plays into this. So here's our figure from Miran, and this is a very small, about this high, maybe 2 feet high, gilt bronze image of a Buddhist deity in the Fogg Museum at Harvard, which some people believe is the earliest Buddhist image ever made, the earliest portable image that we know about, and the face makes mustache, nose, hair, makes a one-to-one correspondence. Well, if we had time, I could do the same kind of exercise with Buddhism that I just did with secular art, particularly textiles from the southern Silk Road in Xinjiang province. You're looking here at the 3 earliest Buddhist statues known. So here's the one we just looked at in the Harvard museums. This one is in the Asian Art Museum in San Francisco. It has a dated inscription, 366. And this one is in Kyoto. So what we are seeing here is India, or farther west, Persia, a Sinified or Chinese face, and this very specific hairstyle with the braids coming down from somewhere. This very specific hairstyle has an almost identical counterpart in a cave in the province, in Gansu province, China's westernmost province, before we get to Xinjiang. And there have been literally thousands of pages of literature on whether this cave dates to 420 or 424. As far as I'm concerned, those 4 years in the picture of the Silk Roads don't really matter. But first half of the 420s gives us a date for what we have here. And the reason that this is so interesting is because of something else inside this cave. So I am at a place called Guyuan in the Ningxiahui Autonomous Region of China. Ningxiahui is a little tiny sliver that wasn't always on the Chinese map. It's become its own autonomous region between the large Gansu province in the west and other provinces like Shanxi to its east. This is a sarcophagus. It's in the basement of the Institute of Archaeology in the city of Guyuan. It was lacquer. It was found by salvage archaeology, meaning somebody tripped, looked underground, water had seeped in, and found this lacquer sarcophagus. We're going to see it twice, but we're looking here the first time because I am interested in this figure with this pleated skirt. This person under the Chinese roof almost definitely is the person buried inside, originally buried inside the sarcophagus. Nothing was inside when it was found. But the pleated skirt usually tells us that we're looking at a clothing style from Korea. Now these pleated skirt figures and this deity are in the same cave from either 420 or 424 that I just showed you. So here I am in Gansu province, and here I am in Ningxia, and here I am in Japan in a tomb from the 7th, 8th century, and the pleated skirt is associated on very good reason with Korea. Koguryo is one of the kingdoms, and the date here is around the year 500. Principle number 3. When studying the Silk Road, use all available evidence, painting, sculpture, architecture, lacquer that I just used, textiles, metalwork. Nothing can be studied independently. Now we move to section 3. The 3, 4, 5 are kind of together, and once in China, many things change. Okay, we've been primarily here. Here's Nia, here's the Southern Silk Road, Bactria, Taxila, Gandhara is here, Parthians are here, Romans are off the map, and so are China. But this territory inside, once we get within what I'm going to call the Chinese sphere, to this place, Kucha, things change. You're looking at 4 images that were studied carefully and assiduously by scholars from all over the world in the 1920s, 30s, 40s, 50s. They're from Bamiyan. If you follow modern history, you know that the Buddhas of Bamiyan were blown up by the Taliban the summer before 9/11. Summer of 2011, this site was largely decimated. What you see here are 4 images from Bamiyan that has been described as the ultimate oasis of the Silk Road. And we have a wooden frame for a Chinese roof, and we have probably the Greek god of the sun, and we have a Buddhist deity next to someone from Iranian sphere in profile, and we have a roundel, and that always tells us Sasanian Iran. Moving somewhat, several hundred kilometers to the east, to a place called Kizil, I have another map coming up, but the place called Kucha, we have these 2 faces. So this is a deity, probably almost definitely Buddhist, who certainly looks European, not Chinese. And this is a figure that people have looked at with the red hair on the walls of Kizil, and they said it's an image of Christ. And we can't explain why, but this looks like something that came out of Byzantine painting. So here's where I am. Kucha is Kizil, and Bamiyan is near Kabul, and the distance isn't great, but it's within what I've just called the Chinese sphere. But this is how China makes herself known, even though the understanding is that most influences are still coming from west to east. So on the left, Bamiyan, and on the right, Kizil, and here's our ceiling, and here's our ceiling, and here's our roundel, this time with a boar, and here's our roundel, this time with a bird. And it gets even more interesting if you go about 20 kilometers away from Kizil to a place called Kumtura, where you get the ceiling on the left, and it has an almost certain date of 400, and you get the decorated deity on the right. But I'm going to finish in an hour, so we move on to topic number 4. Topic number 4 is what it means when the Chinese set of images overtakes the Silk Roads. And this happens largely by 5th and 6th centuries. So at the top, I'm looking at a tomb excavated in western China, Gansu, that people date to the year 400. And on the right, I'm looking at a tomb, again, Koguryo. This is my Korean kingdom that I keep coming back to. 2 chambers joined by a corridor. Both tombs are completely painted. To show you a map, the Korean tomb is off the map. It's up here. The tomb in that I call Dingjiajia tomb is in Jiayuguan. It's here. And this would be the route, and Datong is about to come up. It will be my topic number 5. But the fact is that the dynasty called Northern Wei in around the year 400 and a little bit later conquered this area and moved prisoners. That's one of the ways that west moves east, and that we see, for this reason, the overtaking of these routes by China. So that 400 in the west and around 400, if not a little bit later, in the east, I'm in tombs, and I'm looking at the ceiling of the tomb, and here I have a deity, and here I have a deity. And this one is the Queen Mother of the West. I'm in China, it's a native deity. Here, I'm in Korea, but it's a Buddha. But the central location on the most important wall of the tomb is the same. Now, I've just shown you China in Korea and native symbolism in Gansu. It switches. This is what makes it so important. The Queen Mother of the West has on top of her a lotus, which is a symbol of the Buddha. And the tomb in Korea with the Buddha has the constellations, which come from China, but also the raven with the three-toed raven in the sun, and the toad in here, which is his counterpart in the moon. We have China and we have non-China all together. Both of them have a huge flowering tree. Each of them and everything that we look at on the Silk Roads offers us something that identifies its location. So that in the desert of Gansu, we have adobe architecture. That tells us we're in the desert. And in Korea, we have the spotted fur garments that Koreans are known to wear. Now I'm back at the sarcophagus. Sarcophagus, we don't know who's buried there. We don't know the date it was excavated, but it has everything that I've just shown you from Gansu in the west to Korea in the east. So just to remind you where we've been, here is our occupant. He's not Chinese. He's a person of the steppe. He wears heavy leggings. He wears warm clothes. His hat covers him from wind at the back. He's under a Chinese roof, though. Here are people serving him wearing Korean clothing. Here is a Chinese Buddhist deity. On the front of this sarcophagus, next to the Chinese Buddhist deity, are these two figures. This is a redrawing. You saw the conditions. You saw the condition the sarcophagus is in, and there are labels. This is the King Father of the East, and this is the Queen Mother of the West, the counterpart. And here are our three-toed, here they gave it 3 legs. Sometimes it has 3 legs, sometimes it has 3 toes. Here's our raven in the sun, our toad and hare in the moon. So we have Buddhism, we have native Chinese deities. These are stories of Chinese filial piety. They come out of the classic of filial piety. They're labeled. There's no question that's what they are. Here is our Sasanian or Iranian roundel. Here's a motif we're about to see again. And here's something called the Parthian shot. The Parthian horsemen were known for having the horse continue forward and turning around to shoot. In this case, the horse turns his head back, but his legs don't turn. On this sarcophagus, from this little sliver called Ningxia, in Korea on the top, in Gansu on the west, we have each of the major civilizations of Asia, Eurasia, represented. China, native China, that we'll call it Taoist, Confucian, Buddhist, Sasanian Iran, Indian Buddhism, and something of the nativity of the person. And so I am looking at one of the oldest examples of paper. This is from the 4th century. The cemetery is called Astana. And what we see on this piece of paper, our large tree, our big and little dipper, our raven in the sun, our toad and hare in the moon, service for the deceased under an umbrella, and some piece of the deceased's life. So, Korea over here, Datong, Western China. My next topic, I'm up to number 5 or number 6, is what happens in the city of Datong in the 4th or 5th century. This is another melting pot that I'll just talk about very briefly, but is as rich for this material as the 2nd and 3rd centuries in the desert to the west. I assume I'm in China because I have a Chinese bracket set. I've got Chinese architecture. This is the location of the Yungang Caves. If you've been to China, you've gone to the Yungang Caves. The tombs I'm showing you are from this region. The imagery we see is the imagery we just saw in Korea, the imagery we saw in Gansu. This is between. So we have our large flowering tree. We have the occupant of the tomb under a canopy being served there by smaller servants. The occupants are larger than life. I'm back at my Guyuan sarcophagus. Look at this image. Look at this image, and I'm introducing another one. It is a cart without its rider. The symbolism is the person who once rode in this cart is deceased, is now in the tomb. From countless tombs in Datong, here's our fleur-de-lis, here's our floral pattern. Here, same location. Here's our cart without the rider. Here is our Parthian shot. Here's the man-animal combat. Another tomb in Datong, Sasanian roundel. The occupant always under a Chinese roof. Whenever there's architecture, it's almost always China. And two deities with intertwined serpentine tails that take us to China. And if I go a little further, if I were to introduce Buddhism, but there's no time, so just one example. Sasanian Iran, look at the floral motif and look at what you're seeing on top of a Buddhist cave, and I am in Hebei province of China. What I'm doing now is I think this is my fourth principle, and I'm calling it Morelli Lives. If you ever took an art history course at any time in your life, even when theory dominates, you heard about Giovanni Morelli, who was an 18th century doctor, who collected art and said to art historians, if you examine your work of art like I examine a body, you will know what you're looking at. Look at earlobes, look at fingernails, look at bends in fingers, look at elbows. And this really was the whole basis. This very influential paper that he wrote was the basis for connoisseurship. The fact is, that's what I'm doing. I'm dealing here with a world where there aren't texts. There might be something excavated. It might have a date somewhere in that tomb or in the cemetery. But by and large, I'm still looking at pastiche or collage. So I'm up to my sixth moment here because it's late in the 6th century now. We've looked at places in western or central China where this all comes together in the period between the dynasty Han and the dynasty where China will reunite in the year 618, the Tang, a time when motion by non-Chinese people is coming in and out of China. So in the tomb of a princess, we have a Chinese bird, we have a one-humped camel, we have a shaman who could be from anywhere, and we have Chinese guards. From the same time period, I want to let you know this is where I took my horns. We have seen this headgear for warmth. The person on the Guyuan sarcophagus wears it. We have two figures under a tree. This is a Chinese presentation, but this face, I'm following Morelli now, this face is not Chinese, and we have constellations on the ceiling. Chinese. Another tomb that you probably haven't seen. It belonged to a man named Xu Xianqiu. The year is 571. Chinese birds on the right. The left is what the tomb looks like. And I'm constantly back in Korea. One of the new thrusts of Silk Road studies is finding how Korea fits in. Korea very much was a point on the east for the Silk Roads. So here's Xu Xianqiu wearing ermine, which is something that the peoples of Korea wore, warm garment. And here's a Korean, red and black, under a canopy. And here on Xu Xianqiu's tomb is this deity who turns out to be the god of thunder. And this is where I began. Now you know the roundel is Sasanian Iran. But whether this is a Buddhist or Iranian deity is anyone's guess. And what these two symmetrical creatures are, but probably they come from West Asia, is anyone's guess. But they relate to the pairs of creatures and a bifurcated tree. Pairs of creatures, they could come from Mesopotamia. The bifurcated tree is a symbol of prosperity. It is purely Chinese. As many interpretations for this deity as there was for the cornucopia. This ring is found inside the tomb, and from the same time period, from Guyuan, where the sarcophagus was excavated, one of the most intriguing objects that's come out of the Silk Roads in probably for all time. This is from a tomb that has a date of 569, looking at three sides of a silver ewer. Some people think that these are the three phases of a Roman going off to war, saying goodbye to his wife before he leaves. But others interpret this as Paris, the judgment of Paris, who decides that he will reject the offer from Hera to help him, and he will instead accept Aphrodite's offer to help him win Helen of Troy. The tomb is in the same location as the sarcophagus. The tomb has these warriors. It has the ring you see here. This is where I took my Roman glass from. So here I'm in central China, city called Taiyuan, and here I'm in Ningxia. Ningxia, and I'm looking at a tomb with the silver ewer that has this head on the top of it and the deities that you see here. So point number 6, if you decide that you want to embark on study of the Silk Roads, choose your friends and colleagues wisely. One person can never know enough languages, that's for sure, or have enough information to work independently. This is what makes it a lot of fun. It's wonderful to teach seminars on the Silk Roads. We always caution students, be really careful, don't make this your main thrust, and don't publish unless you're positive. So, this is another example from the 6th century, excavated in Luoyang, the capital on the Silk Roads in the 6th century. People interpret this as an incense burner or as a fire temple. Fire temple, this is why. So here's what you were just looking at. But here, with an inscription, are motifs on a cenotaph in the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. And this is a Zoroastrian deity, Persian, native Persian religion, use of fire temples. Here we've seen this already. We think, if we're on the China side, this is the god of thunder, but that god of thunder may well appear as a deity on a cenotaph with an inscription that tells us the deity is a Zoroastrian. And another tomb from the region, Chinese constellations on the ceiling, but a beautiful figure. It's very small. It's about this big, with curly hair and boots. That certainly comes from the steppe. In conclusion, I want to show you just a couple more of the highlight bodies of material or sites. If I were continuing this a little bit longer, I would move into the end of the 6th century and into the 7th to a group of people known as the Sogdians, who live in the same part of Asia as the Parthians. And like the Parthians, have very few fixed points of reference, but they're middlemen. They move east to west. This is one inlaid funerary couch. And so when I say juxtaposition, when I say merging of traditions, that's exactly what I mean. China, the cart without the rider, the tent from the steppes, sort of China, but look at the headgear, another tent. A setting that we trace to Sasanian Iran, the whirling dervish. And this is all also Sogdian funerary art, certainly a fire temple, certainly the dancing dervish, certainly Sasanian figures, and the same thing there. Now, one of the things that I'm doing is racial or ethnic profiling. And if you want to deal with the Silk Roads, you just have to accept you're doing it, not be embarrassed about it. This is a context when it's one of the ways in which to figure out what we're looking at. So in my racial profiling, I have a Chinese roof, but I have a foreigner, and I have a Chinese princess. And this is something that I can trace into the 13th century. I am looking at a painting from Chinese tomb of the Mongol period. He's a Mongol, and she's a Chinese princess. Yes, Chinese princesses always were given in trade, but there's something about the Chinese female beauty. It's profiling, it's racial profiling. It occurs on the Silk Roads. So, second to last place that I want to mention is the tomb of a princess who died in the year 608 in Xi'an. Definitely Roman glass. Definitely a golden cup. This necklace has never been adequately explained. It has 7 kinds of jewels, and one interpretation is that these are the 7 jewels associated with the Buddha. The clearest, the most logical explanations come from someplace like the 1st century in Afghanistan, Tilya Tepe. And this is a real stretch. So the last point, which has a subpoint, is very rarely in the history of art is something unique. When we have craftsmen and we have patrons, there's usually more than one. When an object is found on the Silk Roads, the search to find something similar may take one across Eurasia or further. We assume we're going to find it. But very occasionally in the world of the prince or princess, she's the daughter of an emperor. She may actually have had something that was completely unique that was made by a craftsman for her. But if we look for comparisons of the jewels, lots of rubies in this golden vessel, excavated in Xinjiang, Burma, very obscure site, along with that mask. And so the subtext to what I just showed you, my last point, the Silk Roads are a rare place in the world where something can actually be unique, or at least for a long time until we make the right connection. These are the kinds of connections people make, and they're not satisfactory. This mask, people look to what we've seen, the flask. People look to the northern nomads, the Scythians. It's a mask. A lot of people wore face masks. They look to the Scythians. Herodotus wrote about them. They rise in Mongolia and Central Asia from the 7th to the 4th centuries BCE. The people look at the shape of the vessel and they say, well, maybe. Well, sometimes one's cup is just too full. Sometimes there's too much. So, for instance, Astana in Turfan already gave us this, but almost nobody knows about this obscure early piece of paper. When they look at Turfan, they look at these figures, or the face that brings us back to where we started, or the figurines with paper arms that date from the 7th century, or the servants, or the elaborate slippers, or the wealth of textiles from Astana that is a site that we didn't even touch on, or perfectly preserved food. Well, we end right here because I could take this to the 12th century. I could continue. And if I did, I would tell you that the 12 signs of the Western zodiac appear in Hebei province of China in the 12th century under a dynasty called Liao. And they appear in Ningxia, which was a hotbed of Silk Road studies, where we have the signs of the Western zodiac and the deities of the Chinese planets. And they also appear, this is now in the Hermitage in Russia, and they also appear on a painting, which is in the monastery Horyuji in Japan. So if there's a conclusion, it is that I could go home tonight and open a new periodical from China and find something that either explains something or that totally turns this upside down. I wish on you a trip to the Silk Roads if you've never been there. I hope you have a chance to see these sites, and I hope you will continue to look at the pictures. Anyone's idea is possibly the right answer in this world of the Silk Roads. So I'll take questions if anybody has questions.
We can
Yeah.
take a couple of questions.
Do you think it's safe to travel the Do you think it's safe to travel the Silk Roads now?
Parts of the Silk Road have always been safe, and parts of it have always been not safe. and you have to go to the right part. I think it's safe. I think it's safe to go across Gansu province. I think it's safe to go to eastern Xinjiang, that is to Turfan. I've been to Kashgar. I personally probably would not go to Kashgar this year. And I certainly won't go to Afghanistan.
Thank you.
Was there any trade from west to east during the early days of the Silk Road?
Roman glass definitely traveled. Yes, definitely glass, one thing that traveled. And I mean, by early, the question is how early. Early, but first millennium BCE. Yeah. It's harder to prove. Could have been, but that was why I began with the Egyptian head, where people have always wanted to see things coming from ancient Egypt. People have wanted to see Mesopotamia. People want to see Assyria. That's a little bit harder. Iran, beginning with the Achaemenids, is when it's easier to see things traveling. And Rome, yeah, Roman Empire. Coins, definitely.
Do you have a personal opinion about the loss of these sites that where the all this beautiful stuff that's been destroyed?
Well, you know, and I don't know if this is a fact. You can read about it on the web. In July of 2001, the Taliban said they were going to destroy Bamiyan. And Philippe de Montebello, who was director of the Metropolitan Museum and the director of the Musée Guimet in Paris, and other people offered just to pay money to save the sites. Didn't work. It's a tragedy. It's different from a human tragedy, but you will find people who say, this is civilization. We all just pass through this earth. This is really destroying anything that's permanent. There's nothing good to say about it. Chinese destroyed a lot during the Cultural Revolution. But what you're really asking me is, do I believe in museums? And the answer is a resounding yes. Somebody like me would never have gotten into this field if there hadn't been Chinese art to see in the St. Louis Art Museum. And anything that has been saved hasn't been destroyed. But I'm just one opinion, and I don't even necessarily speak for the director of the University of Pennsylvania Museum. But yes, something that I would say, archaeology is always political. I say this in class. The race to get to these sites by the 6 Europeans that I showed you at the beginning was a race to get there first and bring things to museums. And some people think it's terrible travesty. Zahi Hawass, who's another name that you know, is a Penn Ph.D., and he's very vocal about the return of everything from Egypt, from our museum, to Egypt. We returned some things to Turkey, but now they're in Turkey and things are in Egypt, and hopefully they'll be preserved. I mean, this is something that we all think about all the time. I'm not exactly answering your question, but I'm an art historian. I like to see things. So maybe that's the answer to your question. If everything were open, then I don't think, open and everything were safe and free, I don't think anybody would care where anything is. But
a lot of these were so big that they couldn't be moved, or
But through the course of my own involvement in Asia, but even my own teachers, there has always been some part of the Eurasian continent where people could not go. That's part of the intrigue. And now it's Afghanistan. I always say to people, I'm too young to have been to Afghanistan. I am. All my teachers got there. But maybe it will open again. We don't know. Yeah.
Just one last question. I remember reading archaeology. I'm a retired high school history teacher in New York State, which is global history 9 and 10. And I remember bringing it for the students, and there was this big brouhaha over, what are we saying now, desiccated corpses, which at the time they called mummies. The fellow with the red hair and Eurasian features. And everybody was like, oh my God, this is evidence, you know, that people from Europe and from Persia and Asia were on the Silk Road, which really is not such a big surprise. Now, how would you respond to that today?
Well, it's not just the Silk Road. If you've been to Iran, or if you know any Iranians, there are green-eyed, red-haired Iranians today. And there were the people that were buried, the famous Beauty of Lolan, or what, the Beauty of Lolan, or the Niad corpse, could have been from this region. So that's, I mean, for somebody like me, it's not a question. Green eyes, people in China don't have green eyes. But as soon as you get north of India to the west, you can have green eyes and red hair.
Thank you.
Well, Nancy. I'm practically speechless, as I'm sure some of you are, about the amount of knowledge that we've gotten today and the mystery of it all at the same time. And our speaker has been amazing, and we'll be pleased to meet you for some informal conversation and a reception outside. Thank you for coming.
Thank you.